Welcome back. Today, we have a very special guest. The beginning of the episode is a little bit funny because our recording platform decided to crash, so then we had to restart. So you're coming in partway through a really fun conversation. But man, I am not someone who has really ever followed astrology. And I met this woman, Deborah Lynna, a few weeks ago at a brunch. And I was just so fascinated with her take on astrology. And she was so grounded and it was so interesting that I was like, listen, you got to be on my podcast. And then in prepping, I was like, do you need anything from me? And she was like, well, do you mind doing maybe like a mini reading? And I was like, sure. And I did not realize what I was in for. She blew my mind. It was so fascinating. And this is just a really fun, exciting conversation. So, yeah, Deborah Lynna is an astrologer with a Taiwanese Dutch-Saturnian blend and a love of translating the languages of the sky. Her readings provide insights into your unique cosmic blueprint to help navigate the space between fate and free will, which we have a cool conversation about at the end of the chat. With real life practical matters in mind, she works with clients on birth chart analysis, predictive calendar planning sessions, and relationship synastry. Synastry. I don't know how you pronounce that word. Claire and I talked about it. We think it's synastry. I just messed it up. But you know what? This is real life. And sometimes I pronounce things wrong because I'm a human. Anyway, thanks for being here as always. And I really hope that you enjoy this episode.
I'll tell you a really funny astrological
Oh yeah,
sort of
what's going,
thing
is
today as
there,
well. But what?
oh, is there something going on in the cosmos that's happening here?
Well, yeah, there's like actually this really sort of disruptive transit that's taking place right now, and I hesitated to book it for this time, but I was like, you know what? There's some other nice aspects, and boom, the minute the tech stuff happened, I was like, of course. I mean, should have just. I didn't want to book it on another day. Like, oh well, whatever.
Oh my gosh, that's so interesting and so funny. Um, yeah, well, I know I shouldn't be so surprised because I am so affected by the moon. Like the full moon, sometimes I have like the
Yes.
craziest energy and I can't sleep. I'm so sensitive to that. So I don't know why I haven't been more into astrology before because it like literally will make me crazy. And I'm like, what are people talking about astrology for? Like, whatever. But I'm like, the moon completely like will derail everything for me. So it's very silly that I don't know more about it. Anyway, round two,
Mm,
welcome back.
yes. Thank you. Thank
um,
you.
for those, I'll talk about it in the intro a bit, but we had a little bit of a test run that ended up um, we needed to switch platforms because obviously there's some sort of crazy transit happening. But to back it up a little bit, thank you so much for being here, Deborah,
Thank
again.
you for having me.
And yeah, as I said previously, I was talking about how much or how little actually I know about astrology. And I'd only really had a reading once briefly a few years ago. And it was fine. I was not blown away. And then in preparation for this, Deborah was really generous to give me a reading and it completely blew me away. I am like totally converted. I don't know about anyone else, but I would like come back to you like 10 out of 10, would totally recommend it. There was just so many small details and massive things that I was like, how could you even know that? Or this is so wild, or just pointing out parts of my chart that really acknowledged like I had never even thought about how you talked about how I have two very different sides, right? That feel almost like
Yes.
unrelated. I feel that inside of me. I've never acknowledged that or talked to anyone about that in my life.
Mm, totally.
So
Yeah.
it's just so
You know,
incredible. Yeah.
it's just, it's so wonderful to hear your feedback. And it's also, you know, it's amazing when the client is amazed, but it's always amazing to me as well. This work is so rewarding in that sense because astrology to me is amazing. It amazes me, you know?
Well,
That
it
is
feels
why
like
I practice it
It feels like
because I'm just
magic.
wowed every day. It does.
Oh, that must be
Yes.
fun. And I think like, especially like, I think you and I both are in the business of really like, connection and helping and holding space. And at the core, people really want to be seen. And I felt
Yes.
very deeply seen by your reading of me in a way that it's just almost uncomfortable. It's like, how do you know this? Like, you must be a witch.
I do sometimes have to give a caveat when, for example, if people are gifting a session, that I would say, just make sure that your friend knows it's quite an intimate deep dive. You know,
It
it's
is. It
not just
is.
sort of like a gift certificate to Barnes and Noble. We're we're going to go places, and your friend or your partner should be comfortable with that. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Oh, I mean, you were referencing stuff. It was so funny too, because you're so wonderful and grounded and professional. And I think when you think about astrology, often you think about people being so like airy fairy. So here you are talking about these like major work themes and some emotional stuff and where the direction my career is going. And then you're like, and then you started talking about my relationship to sex in a specific way. And I was like, whoa, that's right. Wow, we're really going all over the place. So like she's not wrong. But before we go deeper into this, and I know I'm sorry to make you repeat yourself, but I
No, no.
loved what you said. I always like to ask how people find their way into their zone of genius or what they're doing. And yeah, if you could just share a little bit about how you came to be an astrologer. I'm sure there's budding astrologers or people who are really curious to follow their passions out there who would absolutely love to hear that.
Yes. So I was about 13 or 14 when I started having interest in, things that are related to the occult or mysticism, and I would buy books on spells and try and cast spells into the ocean and then sort of run back into my room because I was like scared about what I just did. It was just, there was this sort of desire to connect to nature in that way, which I didn't fully understand. And I didn't have any place to go and ask those questions. And although I grew up in a household that was very multidisciplinary where faiths are concerned,
Mhm.
so these different belief systems, were always in my life, but not this one. And so I let that go for a long time, and it was, through many years, I would, buy the odd astrology book. I would actually consistently go to astrology readings.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until I was sort of ready to make a real change in my career that I was like, you know what, let me just give this a shot. Let me just study a little bit. And at that point, basically when I first started studying, I immediately knew this was the path that I needed to take. And when I made that commitment to myself, my teacher felt like he dropped out of the air. So
Yeah.
that was sort of the point of no return. Yes.
I love that because what you're speaking to essentially is the idea I talk a lot about here and my clients with alignment, right? When you get connected
Yes.
to start listening to yourself, it's so incredible. It does seem crazy and like magic that like it's so wild. I cannot say how many times, especially because I've been in this space for, roughly 10 years. And in the beginning, it was very related to nutrition. And people would come to me because they wanted to lose weight. And then, a few sessions in, we realize, they're eating the sugar or drinking or whatever it is because they hate their job. And then we get them connected to like
Yeah.
what they want to do. And then 2 weeks later, someone offers them the job or they find the school or the mentor. And it is truly like they came out of thin
Yes.
air and it's wild. And I think that's so incredible. And I always like to point that out because I think we believe that work has to suck or be boring. And like, I think a lot of people feel like there's
Yeah.
got to be a separation. And like, no, listen to yourself, do what you love. Everything weirdly seems to fall into place. And while you were growing up and getting astrology readings, what did you seek out? Like, how did they help you? Or what did you feel Was it just the interest alone? Did you think it was really interesting? Like, what drew you to it, or did you find was the most helpful from the readings personally?
I mean, I think also because I'm half Chinese, and so
What's the other half?
your yearly Dutch,
Oh,
Dutch,
I'm Danish
and
and Filipino.
yes. So it's kind of like the astrology for the Asian side is a very sort of normal part of our upbringing,
Mhm.
and so that was always sort of just a given. There wasn't too much thinking about like, oh, our annual reading. It was only maybe in my 20s that you know, I remember very distinctly having this moment in front of an astrologer where he told me something again about myself. I'm like, you've never met me. How would you know this? Which really validated my experience. And
Mhm.
it was so overwhelming and so powerful that really I feel to this day, it's one of the things that I hope I can offer in readings because it was something that um, made me look at my life in a completely new way. And I'm so grateful for that split second.
Yeah. Well, I felt very seen in really interesting and new ways yesterday. And that is always so beautiful. I love, like, part of this podcast is I just love introducing people to tools and modalities that gives them permission to be more of themselves or to understand
Yes,
themselves more. And I have never, like, I have the pattern app. Like, I know my like
yes.
sun, moon, and rising. And like sometimes I'll read the pattern and be like, whoa, but never did I didn't realize the extent of how seen I could feel or how useful astrology could be until yesterday. You blew me away. Absolutely. Absolutely. You guys, I totally recommend 10 out of 10. Go see her. Um, but I mean, you were bringing some things up yesterday that I didn't even know existed, like the difference. And I'd love for you to speak to this a little bit between like Western astrology and Vedic astrology. You were talking about, medical astrology. I don't know anything about that. You were talking about people come to you to decide on dates, whether to like sell houses or trade, stocks and stuff. None of that even I had no idea that existed. So can you speak, I guess, initially a little bit about like what's the difference maybe between Vedic and Western? And then I'd love to hear more about medical astrology.
Yes. So they all have different techniques. And even within the Indian system, even within Western astrology, there are different ways that we can what we call cast a chart, or we can even put together interpretations about the chart. So all of these things are very specific, and so that's why oftentimes it's like going to see a doctor. If you have a specific question, you're going to see a doctor that has that specific speciality.
Mhm.
um, and what I the Vedic system, or Jyotish as it's also called, is so great in terms of predictive work. It gets into a lot of great specificities, but both systems have its merits and have great techniques, and I like to draw on both.
Great. And then, I mean, the medical stuff was so interesting. Like, I didn't even realize like the signs correlate to different parts of your body. Do you want to talk a little bit
Yes.
about how that works? And, if you wanted to go through the signs, that could be kind of cool. I feel like that would be an interesting thing for people to know in terms of like, you were talking about like Taurus and like neck and like that to me is pretty cool and just how that could be useful.
Yes, I love medical astrology, although I'm not a medical practitioner, and so I don't. So I do give this is a caveat, a waiver out here that everyone should still seek their own medical professional opinions. But I think medical astrology is a very basic and practical way to understand some of the mechanisms in your own health, and wellness. Where are your more vulnerable spots? Where are the things that you're actually very strong at? And at different parts of the year or different years, those vulnerabilities or those strengths might be more apparent. So for example, the Sagittarius is often related to sciatica, and so oftentimes when people have a lot of Sag planets or there is a lot of Sag transits, that might flare up. And so that would be a time where you want to make sure that you are, stretching correctly and or not ignoring those. And so those are more practical ways that I think we can use astrology just off the bat. Forget all of the sort of deep inner work we can do with that. But and yeah, it was always used for a long time. Renaissance doctors had to be astrologers as well, and they were able to relate to what was happening in the transits to what was happening for people. And so I think we lost touch with that for a while, but it's definitely coming back, and more people are using it now.
That's so interesting. Okay, so for the people like me who don't really know what to start, maybe they know their sun sign. Do you want to go over, sun, moon, and rising initially, and how that's helpful, what that means, how that could help people in knowing a little bit more about themselves?
Yeah, I think what I also I think it's great, for example, on the point about the pattern app or other apps out there
Hmm.
now, that it's
Yeah.
great that people are having an interest because it's bringing an awareness where in previous years we only knew our sun sign,
Yeah.
which represents, it's the day we were born. It informs us about, maybe what our physical experience is like. It represents our life purpose. It can be our life battery. It has a lot to do in medical astrology as well.
Hmm.
Um, and the rising sign, although it's often called a mask, it is it's it is more about your physical experience and day-to-day life.
Hmm.
The moon, on the other hand, is your internal emotional experience. Now, what's more important is actually where all of the sun, moon, and the different planets are placed in the chart, because and that's dictated by your time of birth.
Hmm.
And that is going to inform people a lot more about what the chart is about.
Hmm.
Because otherwise, a Pisces sun is just like everybody else, and we all have very different lives. And I would actually take this moment to say that having your accurate birth time is important
Hmm.
part of the reading.
Yeah.
And I encourage everyone to do their best to get the correct birth time when asked if you're doing a reading. And also that there is a possibility to trace back your birth time using rectification methods that astrologers can actually backtrack. If you don't have an accurate birth time, they can help to work backwards to find your birth time. And I think that, so people don't feel like there's a lack of hope. There are solutions. There are solutions. And yeah, there are many techniques which can be helpful, so people feel like they can still use astrology.
Yeah, that's great. Wow, I had no idea. That's so interesting. You can figure that out. Okay, so they talk about so that your sun is, yeah, the day you're born. Your moon is what
Yes,
then?
more your emotional experience.
Okay. Okay.
It has to do a lot with your internal experience, and
Hmm.
also, the moon represents many different things in our life. It can represent our mother. It can represent other women in our life. It can represent, the breasts when from a medical perspective, or even the stomach. The gut feeling, the moon. So there are lots of interpretations, but again, it really depends on the chart. But that's a
Hmm.
more overall approach.
Right. And then the rising sort of is how people see you or like how
Yes,
they. Hmm.
it's how they see you. It's how you see the world oftentimes as well,
Hmm.
and how you experience things. And if you have more planets in that part of your chart, that might be more emphasized.
Hmm.
So I think part of the challenge with just knowing the sun, moon, and rising
Hmm.
is that if you don't have a lot of emphasis in that area of your life, you may not relate to some of the material that you read
Yeah.
online, and
Right.
you kind
Right.
of lose connection with it. So once you've had a reading, you know, for example, your astrologer can say, well, you know, see how you're feeling when the moon is in Taurus, and
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
whether these areas of your life will have some changes, or this is a good time to do X, Y, and Z, because then it becomes a more useful tool, which I think is where the magic really lies.
Yeah. So it's what's being able to see the chart, and it was so beautiful. I'm going to pull mine up that you sent me, and ask more questions about it. Being able to see the specifics of where everything is helps it become a lot more bio-individual, essentially. You're able to have a much more
Yes.
specific reading. Talk to me about the North Node and the South Node.
Yes,
Explain
it's
what
such
those
an
are.
interesting, yeah, that's such an interesting part of the chart. So much of our life is about the things that we don't want to be repeatedly doing, because we kind of came into this life already having a past life knowledge, or having an innate knowledge of that activity or that behavior or that trait.
Hmm.
And what we're here to learn is something new. And that something new is really described by the North Node. And the North Node is sort of our Dharma. It's the lessons that we're here to learn. It's the things that we're supposed to try and go towards. And there's always this opposition in our charts where we have to learn to let go of the things that we already know and that we use and that we do as a means of security,
Hmm.
and go towards the things that maybe are uncomfortable, but that we know is the right path. And that
Hmm.
right path, the North Node, is not an easy one. And depending on your chart, again, sometimes it's easier than others or more obvious than others.
Hmm.
But it's often the missing link, and we don't really come to it until into our 40s. Sometimes,
Really?
of course, you can get lucky. Yeah, you can get lucky and of course identify it. But I think that the true knowledge of um, what that behavior or trait or attribute or action is that one is supposed to go towards, is said to really only mature in the 40s. So it's good to know what it is so that we can already be actively working towards it.
Yeah. It was so interesting. You were saying, like looking at my chart, and it sounds, I don't know if this is true for everyone, but you were saying sort of the first part of my career was very like oriented towards things. And like I don't, it's so funny to talk about this stuff because I never know what I believe in, but you were sort of like, well, you came into a lot this life with a lot of these, essentially like these creative skills that I used in the first part of
Yes.
my professional career as an actor. And it was really funny to hear that because well, I don't know what I believe that like intuitively felt true to me. And I was like, oh wow, a lot of that stuff
Mhm.
did come naturally to me. So do most people's, is that kind of everyone's trajectory? Was that specific to me? Like, do a lot of people start out with sort of more south node oriented like skills or directions in life and then sort of pivot towards north?
I think your chart is it's a really distinct example
Okay.
of what was going on before, and then what can come in the future. And we do we do start off with things that are related to our south node,
Hmm.
but knowing which direction we should be heading in is not always so clear. It really
Yeah.
depends on how the chart is laid out, and sort of how, you know, what fate brings you on the day that
Right.
you were born and the solar system was the way it was. So it really, yeah, it depends. Some people have more difficulty identifying what that might be than others. Although, what I would say is that, you know, people are intelligent. We know innately what's right for
Yeah.
us and
Yeah.
what's good for us. And sometimes it's just hidden a little bit deeper than,
Hmm.
than others. So
Yeah.
it depends on how willing you are to look.
Yeah. And is that something that you help people with? Do people come to you and they're a little bit lost in terms of direction? And like, is this something you can help? Like, if they didn't really know, like, I feel like I'm pretty strong on what my North Node is at this point. But if I was sort of at this
Yes.
place a couple of years ago where I'm like, I know I'm done, like, it's really interesting. I don't know if you're finding this, but so many of my clients and people in my life are ending careers and stepping into the unknown in like, I think, I don't know what this period is, but I actually have a lot of clients who are like, I don't really know what to do next. Is this something that
Yes.
you innately are able to guide people towards depending on where in their chart their North Node is?
Yes, it's going to be a combination of the North Node, the other planets, the sun definitely, as that also represents our purpose. But I see people when they are going through periods of transition. They've
Mm.
kind of maybe at this point tried all the, tried all the tools in their toolkit, and
Yeah.
they're like, wait, maybe I'll just try astrology,
Yeah. I mean, I
And
get sort of the same thing too. It's like I did everything and
yeah,
nothing's working. I guess I'm gonna just throw some money, like figure out what else to do.
yeah. And but for sure, I think that I see people at their moment of transition, and they usually have some idea, but again, they haven't just really listened to what's happening internally or around them. Or I'll say something and they're like, you know what? I was already thinking about that, but that just sounded like a harebrained idea. And I think astrology, it's the study of the cycles of time, and it's a study of the cycles of nature. So what it's teaching us is how to be more in tune with nature.
Mhm.
Just like when it's a full moon, we feel more active and we feel more like alive and want to go out and engage with people. It's the same thing when, it's raining, we don't want to go outside. It's like telling the weather, right? So we need to start to align ourselves to where are we in the cycles of our own natural rhythms, because we
Mm.
have this sort of cookie cutter approach in society where you're here, so you should be at this stage in your career or at this stage in your relationship. And then people come into these readings and they're like, why am I not matching up with this sort of standard cycle that we're supposed
Right.
to be living? And there's confusion because there's a disparity between expectation and reality. And
Yeah.
so astrology is bringing you into focus with what your own personal reality is,
Mm.
coming to terms and embracing that, and
Yeah.
being like, this is your cycle. So, now's the time to either go to the beach or not. Okay, we can discuss what that looks like for you.
Yeah. Well, and
But
on some level, I'm sure
yeah,
that's like profound permission also, right? To
yeah,
have someone outside of them who doesn't even know them look at this thing just because they know their birthday and sort of speak to their intuitive whispers, essentially, right? Like call out things
yes,
that maybe they themselves were ignoring. Like that's got to be pretty profound for some people.
yes, absolutely. And I also think that not only can it allow us to just sort of fine tune into that intuitive knowing, but
Mhm.
also we tend to be in a hurry for everything to happen like this. And if you know, for example, that, wait, your career peak is coming in 3 years. So, don't worry, it's
Yeah.
still coming. This is a period of growth, or this is a period of challenge, and kind of relax into that.
Mhm.
Then people also feel like, okay, this is part of a cycle. It's not like I don't have to have my relationships sorted, my housing, my money, my career all done by January 1st. you know.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's great. It get trust, right? And it
Yeah.
I think culturally, I loved what you were saying, right? These like cultural benchmarks of like married, children, the house, all of the things that you're
Yeah.
supposed to have. I mean, I think more and more we're all getting out away from that, right? And people are starting to kind of make their own paths, especially like with people being able to work remotely and after the pandemic, all of that kind of
Yes.
thing. That I think giving people that permission to slow down or just trust themselves incredible. And even like, I didn't realize that, you know, my sun sign, I'm Taurus. I've like, we were looking at my chart and I'm like a ton of Taurus and a ton of Sagittarius, and they just are like complete opposites, which again, like that was really interesting the way you called that out. I was like, wow, this is very much my experience of my personality. It's like, I'm either all one way or all the other way. And it was strange too, because like the pandemic allowed me to sit in, like I feel like how I describe it, like when we were speaking about this yesterday, and I maybe this is the more Taurus and the more, because you were, you know, I guess what is it? My Mars is near my sun, right? Which makes
Oh,
me very sort
yes.
of like
Yes.
driven. And the
Yes.
pandemic was this really interesting period where I could just like focus and study and learn. And I spent a couple of years like building and working on my business. And, you know, it was the pandemic. So I was sleeping and hiking and not seeing people and not going out. And you know what I mean? It was
Mm,
like this one area of my
totally.
life where I can be like very focused and driven and meditating 2 hours a day and like really like working on myself and what I'm doing in the world with my purpose. And then like fast forward to like last year and last summer, it was like the first time, you know, I had settled in a new place after like moving around a bunch. I'd made community. All I did was like I didn't mean to, but like I came to Lisbon and I was like full Sagittarius energy, where I was like drinking wine and dancing all night and just like completely like partying in a way I don't think I had since I was like 25. And it was funny because I had made one of my closest friends I'd made in London when I was living there during the pandemic was knew me in the other phase where it was like she was an herbalist,
Right.
I was a health coach, we met for coffee, I was always asleep or meditating and like completely just this one way. And she kept sending me these, like we actually, she like kind of was like, I don't think we're aligned anymore and didn't want to be my friend because she was like, you've gone off the rails, like I'm worried about you, when really it was just these two extreme, like I had gone so extreme, and I think so many of us had during the pandemic, where I swung back in the other direction and like didn't get to express that part of myself. And it was so interesting how you phrased it,
Yeah.
because you were like, you have these two phases, two ways of being, and they almost can't even see each other, like the way which how the planets
Yes.
are. And I've really experienced that in life, where it's like I've been all in on maybe a relationship and that's all I see, or all in on work. And I think my marriage suffered from periods of time where like I just gave everything to my acting career and it was all I could
Mm.
see. So like that strive for balance is really interesting. And I didn't even ask you, like with that kind of chart, is there anything you recommend or just is being mindful of it enough?
Yeah, no, I definitely am not in the business of telling people how to live their lives. So all I would say, all I would say is that I think having an awareness of those dynamics in our life naturally, that these kind of events may occur or that these kind of sentiments may come up,
Mhm.
makes people aware of um, the choices they're making. So when they do
Mhm.
make a choice, or when you make a choice, you'll know like, okay, this is definitely going to activate this area of my life. And that means that I'm choosing not to do the other, for example.
Yeah.
And then we kind of take responsibility for choices in our life. And there's, you know, just knowing that doesn't mean we're in control of anything.
No, no, I don't
I'm
think
not
we
saying
we rarely
that.
are. I feel like once
Just
we
to
are not.
clarify. But it does inform us about how we're moving with our natural energies. And I think that's the kind of interesting element. And actually, you know, as you were speaking about even being in relationships, the interesting thing about relationships and being with people is that when you're living with somebody or you're spending a lot of time with somebody else, essentially what it is that their chart is on top of yours. So their all their planetary energies are on top of yours. And so all of those different little interactions, they will light up certain elements of your life. And so when people come and they're like, oh, what about, you know, am I compatible with this sign or that sign? It's really never that straightforward, because relationships are far more complex and so are the planets. And you can kind of break it down into like, well, your communication is like this, but actually, you know, you enjoy certain different things from your career perspective, or this can actually be helpful for your health even.
Mhm.
Um, it becomes much more specific. Yeah.
Yeah. So when people come to you for partnership readings, whether that's like business or romantic, it's kind of like, okay, these are where you light each other up and these are where you might struggle. Is that sort of, does that
Yes.
explain it accurately?
Yes, yes, because I think there is some expectation sometimes that astrology can tell us whether or not we should or should not be with somebody.
Yeah.
And ultimately that's a choice.
Yeah.
And and the astrological consultation can provide us with information about, well, what are all those areas specifically? Like, let's break it down. And then we can make a conscious choice, like, I'm okay with that. I can live with that. Or no.
Yeah.
This is
No.
this is, like, so it's, I think those relationship readings are more confronting in a way because they reveal to us that we are the ones that are making the active choices, and it's you can't just put the blame on, oh, it's because they're a Gemini or whatever,
Right.
some common thing like that. It's actually a lot deeper than that. Yeah. But
Yeah.
I think the relationship readings are amazing, and I find them very beneficial. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be really fun. But it makes sense, like just looking back at some of the relationships I've had, and as I am so purpose driven and like passionate around career, which you told me my chart and that felt very true. Um, that I've been in relationships that have really supported the growth of and the expansion of my creativity and my business and I've been in relationships that have really like sucked all the energy out of and have made it almost impossible to connect to my creativity.
Mm.
So yeah, it's cool. It's cool to think about that in retrospect and then understand that it's like, okay, certain people are going to, light up certain areas and certain people might just take away or distract or drain because of just how they're designed, which is cool. Where,
Yeah.
right, where it's not just like anyone's all good or all bad. It's what experience do you want to have?
Yes. Yes, exactly. You have to make that choice ultimately. And I think the idea of making choices is scary because it means that, you know, we're aware that it means we can't have it all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was like we closed. I didn't really ask many questions yesterday because you just like blew my socks off and you're just like telling me all this crazy stuff. And I was just like, okay, wow, wow, wow. But the only thing I did ask because yeah, it's on my head and my heart. Since I remember I love kids. I always thought I'd have kids. I always wanted to have kids. I always wanted to be a mom. And I remember when we were kind of at the point where like my ex-husband and I were like gonna maybe have a baby or split, go in one of two directions. And then when we went in the other direction, that, was a little bit heartbreaking because I also like, society
Yeah.
says, women over 30 might as well be dead anyway. I used to be an actress. So that's really something that you get a lot.
Right.
That was like very much like you might as well, just throw in the towel, dig your own grave. And I was like, turning 36. And then, it's been interesting ever since then. I was doing a lot of like panic dating for a little while because I was like, I have to have a baby. Like, ah! And then in the past couple of years, I really realized that was not getting me anywhere good and was, making a lot of fear-based decisions, which I really don't like, I really try not to do ever. But it's funny
Mm.
because I still really feel this pull and it's about to be my birthday next month. And as I, get into my 40s, you just start to hear those voices. So I asked you about having kids and you said something that really stuck out to me that I thought was really like beautiful and profound about you looked at my chart and you talked about just where my south node was, right? You were saying there's
Yes.
lots of like creativity and having children's creative. So everything creative is really satisfying for me. And that very much rings true. It feels like I'm living my purpose or, creativity is emotionally really, really satisfying. But then I was really fascinated by what you said about the North Node and being the placement of the North Node and the world's children.
Yes. Yes, I
And
really, yeah.
yeah, I mean, do you mind sharing what you said yesterday? Or I could talk about how that affected me, but
Yes.
that was like a really beautiful and interesting perspective that I hadn't thought about.
Yes, I think this idea of in the charts, there is this polarity between your own offspring, the children that you have physically, and then also the world's children. So that could not necessarily mean like children as in, by age, but just also people who one cares for like a child. And I think as individuals, we have this opportunity to be caregivers, to be mothers, but not necessarily only for our own offspring, especially increasingly now as we are women with choices. Many of us have
Yeah.
choices. So,
Yeah.
so this idea that there is also a part of the chart that's dedicated to the world's children. And that means that, you may be interested in taking care of other people in that nurturing way. And maybe that is actually one of the callings. And I think we traditionally, and even in the very old traditional textbooks from astrology, we're so focused on that being the only option of us having the physical child.
Mhm.
But actually, there's such a multitude of ways in which we can express that. And increasingly, um, people are able to look after other people in that same way. And then they kind of take on that, and they take on that sort of mothering role. And, the astrology very clearly shows that. And more often than not, women who have these questions around children, they have this sort of duality in their charts where the house of children versus the house of the world's children is lit up, and it's sort of like a choice that they're making. So yeah, astrology definitely reveals any questions we have. There'll be some answers.
Yeah, that felt really profound and beautiful and heartbreaking, right? Because we talked about it, and you're like, not to say that you can't or you can't do both, but we can't, put 100% into everything we do, and you have to look at, where you put energy, and yeah, that really sat with me, and I've been thinking a lot about that. Um, I want to ask one more question about or just say something more about my chart and then ask some more general questions. But I thought it was really interesting. I didn't know that your sun sign correlated so much to your purpose or career often. That's generally true for most people?
The sun sign definitely has to do with our purpose because the sun is the only thing in our little corner of the solar system that gives us light.
Mhm.
So from that perspective, it's kind of the beacon that we should be going towards, and it provides us a purpose. It is associated with career, but it has to do mostly with our own sense of creativity more than career, I would say.
Right, right,
And
right.
depending on where the sun is, we can say, yes, that's going to be more towards your career focus or whatnot. Now, the career is a very important part of the chart, but what career just means is the work that we do in the outer world. It doesn't
Mhm.
necessitate to the job that pays the bills. Those are
Mhm.
not necessarily the same thing.
Oh, wait, say that again. So career in the chart doesn't necessarily mean like traditional job. It sort of is like how we show up in the
Yeah,
world.
yes, it's how we show up in the world. It's what we do outside of our sort of home, outside of our home environment, whether we're out as a spokesperson for something, or if we work in a traditional large company, or if we work for ourselves. There's so many ways in which we can show up that's outside of our own home environment.
Yeah.
And sometimes people have these careers or these experiences that they do in the outer world, but they make money through a complete other means.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that shows up in the chart as being very separate, like how I make my money is completely different from what I'm actually doing in my so-called, quote unquote career. So there's for some people it's the same, for a lot of people it's different.
Yeah. Well, I loved it too, because you were saying like I'm very much meant to have like a money career out in the world. But you're like, but other people
Yes.
might, the thing maybe they're supposed to be doing is being really good at volleyball, which made me laugh
Yes.
because like that's my mom's favorite thing on the planet. And I think that is her, life purpose and not how she made money, but like truly. And I was like, oh, that makes total sense.
Yes.
And then it kind of blew me away too, because you were talking about like career for me, and you're like, the body, how we take care of ourselves, self-worth. And it was just sort of like boom, 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 like, oh yeah, this is totally like North Node stuff and like what I've been moving towards and like now the crux of what I'm doing. And yeah, that was just so wild. I mean, I could talk about my own chart and the other thing I thought was so wild was like I have very little water in my chart, and no matter what, like if you are lacking one of the elements or you don't have very much of it, you'll crave that. And like I just was when you said that you're like you want to live in the water, you like being in the water. I'm like that's just wild. Like yes, I want to be a mermaid. I want to live on the ocean. Like I'm literally, I will take 2 showers a day. Like I love water and swimming. And then you were talking about like, sort of feeling things and psychology, right? Is that like kind of watery
Yes,
stuff?
yes.
And it's like, I am so drawn towards water. I think that's so fascinating. There's just so many. I mean, I have to come back and ask you a million questions now because my mind is
Happily.
open. But a segue out of my chart, I promise, is I thought this was interesting. Because this is something that comes up a lot, right? Like I think we hear about people, their sun sign or sun, moon, and rising, and then the only other thing you really hear about besides like the full moon is Mercury being in retrograde.
Yes.
But it's funny because Mercury is in a part of my chart. You said that like when it's in retrograde, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And I was like, oh, that's so fascinating. Like it really is specific from person to person. But me aside, can you explain a little bit about our obsession with Mercury in retrograde and how that could be different for everyone or certain things we all maybe need to look out for?
Yeah, I think this is great clickbait. I
Yeah.
think that's what I would call it, as they say. But um, different branches of astrology have different interpretations for Mercury's retrograde. So the retrograde motion just simply means that the planet is closer to the Earth, and so its effects are felt more strongly. And the retrograde motion of Mercury happens a few times a year, so it's not a rare occurrence by any means. It's a very natural part of the cycle. And depending on a number of things like what is this what is the natural state of your Mercury in your own chart, what kind of areas of life is it responsible for depending on what time you were born. All of these things play into how the retrograde motion of the transits will affect you. And I think that the retrograde planets have, I think people have a fascination or some type of obsession because it's a really easy way to make an excuse or to push off something that didn't go well. What's because it's the retrograde.
Right.
But from an Jyotish perspective, in the Vedic or Indian tradition, retrograde planets are considered very powerful, and in certain positions, they can bring a lot of amazing information, and they can bring a lot of amazing results. You try meditating during the start of a Mercury retrograde, you will be very surprised especially if you are very strongly mercurial. So there are many ways in which we can use that transit, like any other transit, for our benefit. But yeah, it's one of those things that I don't know, someone just sort of took off with it, and again, it makes people feel like they can put the blame on. But yeah, lots of ways we can use it in its to its benefit.
Right. And it just sort of depends on its placement in your chart.
Yes, yes. That's why I hesitate when, even giving updates on social media and so forth, because people are like, well, they want to know their transits, but oftentimes, if you haven't had like a proper reading or if you haven't been given some guidance, you're not really sure what to look out for.
Yeah.
It's like going on a keto diet before having done your levels checked.
Right,
and really
right, right, right,
understanding whether that's the correct approach to your life.
right.
Um, you could really benefit from this period, and it might not be a great time to hide under a rock.
What is one of the biggest misconceptions or the things that people get wrong about astrology, in your opinion? Or that's like frustrating that you see?
I think just more that it has so many practical uses to
Yeah.
everyday life, a bit like how we talked about um, when is a good opportunity for you to, is it a good time to quit your job? Is it a good moment to build your house? There are many ways in which we can, if we understand what's happening in the planetary weather, we can make the appropriate choices for ourselves.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that people are not aware of just simply how specific it actually is, how um, how practical we can actually use it in our life. And very often there's more just sort of more judgment that's made around it. So for example, they'll be like, oh, I hate Scorpios, as a sort of like blanket approach, can't trust a Scorpio or can't trust a Gemini, whatever one of those stereotypes are. But actually, when you do a reading, you start to see, oh, actually, I've got planets in all of these different signs, or each of these signs is a different area of my life. And so actually, astrology then creates empathy as
Hmm.
opposed to judgment. And that
Yeah,
is what I think people are missing.
I love that. What do you wish people knew more about when it comes to astrology?
Oh, I think people come to, first of all, I think people come to astrology in their own time. So um, I don't think there's no, I feel like people have a reading and then it either speaks to them or it doesn't, like any other modality. Um, and I don't think there's anything that they need to know per se, but I do think that in order to really give it a shot, it's important to actually try to have a reading. And I'm not
Mhm.
saying this like it doesn't need to be with me, but to have an
Right.
actual reading, because that experience is different from reading about it online, or referring to an
So
app or
different.
something like that.
So different. So different. Because even like I just brought up the pattern app, which I read sometimes and it's sometimes creepy and sometimes I'm like, what are you talking about? But it's like you go into your chart and it's like there's so many things like, okay, we know about the sun and moon, and it's like my Venus is in Gemini. And like yesterday you were talking about how much Venus rules. I had no idea, right? Like
Yes,
Venus,
yes, yes.
like, can you speak a little bit about like I think we don't even understand, like I don't even remember, but I feel like it was career, it was related, like what are the things that Venus rules, or is it so are
Yes, it had a
associated with?
lot to do with, yeah, well, for you, it had a lot to do with career. It had a lot to do with all the groups and community that you're part of. And
Hmm.
Venus herself has her own representation. But I think um, what's interesting is that every planet in our chart directly correlates to something very real in our material life.
Yeah.
And when we're reading the apps or when we're reading information online, it's just speaking in generalities. So
Right.
it's very hard to relate. But
Hmm.
actually, astrology, mathematically, when we calculate the degrees and everything, it's actually from the point of view of being on Earth. So from
Hmm.
the point of view of being on Earth, we can calculate mathematically the degrees of where the planets are. And so everything correlates back to being on Earth.
Yeah.
And it is actually an incredibly it's a mathematical calculation, right?
Hmm.
And part of my own personal practice when I start doing the charts is I calculate everything by hand. And
Oh,
I want to connect with the mathematics of the chart, and then I go into the actual interpretation because I think it's actually grounded in something very scientific.
yeah.
And people lose track of that, being like, oh, Venus in the sky. Of course, it's hard to relate to that.
Right. Right. So besides getting a chart reading, which I absolutely recommend doing and doing with Deborah, truly. Uh, and what you were saying to me yesterday, because I have so much Taurus and Sagittarius, you were like, see how you feel when the moon is in Taurus or the moon is in Sagittarius. Like, see, you know what I mean? Are there like, is that a good place to start besides getting a reading? Like, what are things that people can do to start like sensing into their chart or, seeing how they feel different on a full moon, or, are there small hacks that people can start to check in with themselves more?
Yeah, I love the lunar diary. So um every 2 days or so the moon will change signs. And of course, every month we have a new moon and a full moon. So all the apps, there are many hundreds of apps which tell you these things, but you can start to see if you have a sun in Taurus. How do you feel on when the moon passes through there? What areas, not only but how you feel, but what are certain events that tend to take place around those times? Because those will probably inform you a bit more about, okay, this area of my life, whenever the moon is in Taurus, I am working really hard. I am fully in front of my career. I'm really focused on that. And then you can get into the habit of going in that flow so that, for example, that week is not the week that you would want to go on a holiday because you know you're going to be in a work mode.
Yeah.
And that's how we
Yeah.
start to get more in flow with our charts at a really basic level, but it's so effective.
That's so cool. That's such a really interesting tip. Because yeah, I know like full moon, I don't sleep well, but beyond that, I have no idea. And then it was neat yesterday because
Right.
the moon was in Taurus yesterday, and you're like, oh, that's fun that we're talking. And I was like, what does that
Yes.
even mean? And
Yes, yes, yes.
so when it is in more of your sign, you're saying you're kind of lit up, right?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of it paints a picture that we were doing something that's related to the work that you're doing. We're
Yeah.
also focused on you. The moon has to do with your emotions. We were also exploring this more emotional experience, and it makes you more sensitive to those topics. The moon really just paints a picture of what's happening in the day, and I also mentioned that the moon in Taurus is a really wonderful time to um, go out to a restaurant and eat because the moon in Taurus is ruled by Venus, and Venus has to do with our pleasurable activities. And so our palate tends to be more sensitive when the moon is in Taurus, and we may enjoy food more. There's this sort of like love of life in that material world, and we can really dive into that. Whereas if the moon is in Pisces, that's a time where we might want to go and do some really deep meditation because that's how we're going to be able to access our emotions more. Taurus moon, when you're meditating on a Taurus moon, you might feel more grounded, but I think you might go deeper on a Pisces moon, so things like that.
Well, I know, and I was even going back to like the medical stuff. You're like, yeah, you don't want to start a detox in a Taurus moon. You'll be starving. Where I
Yeah.
was like, wait, that's amazing. Like, I don't know, like, what do you, that makes sense, I guess. Because yeah, Taurus indulgent. And what was it like Gemini, you're picky or something? Like, do it then. Is that what you said?
Oh, on a Virgo
Oh,
moon.
Virgo,
Yes,
Virgo.
yes, yes.
Like, I
Because
love.
actually, yeah, no, I was just saying that like on the Virgo moon, the Virgo rules the parts of our body that chooses things in our body. So
Mm.
selects things, is selective. And so, it helps to eliminate things that are not, and then Pisces sort of absorbs everything. So when you have a Virgo moon, you're going to be a little bit more picky, you're going to be more detail oriented. You want to do your accounting when it's on a Virgo moon and not on a Pisces moon,
Oh.
things like that.
Oh my God, this is so I'm like, all right, I have to look into this. This is wild. So, say someone is considering scheduling a reading with you or anyone. Um, how do you best utilize the time? Like, what are the types of questions? What are the things they could come for? I mean, it obviously depends on, who that you're going to, obviously, because I don't know if I've never even met anyone that does like medical astrology. So, that's got to be specific to the reader. But, are there, could it just be anything like intuitively? Because even at the end, I was like, I don't even know if I can ask you this, like if this is an appropriate question to ask when I was talking about kids. How do I know what to do when I go to a therapist. What do I do when I go to an
Yes.
astrologer? Maybe is the question.
Ask any question you want. That is
I
my,
love it.
that's all. Anything that comes up for you, you should feel free to ask, because I get that a lot. There's also, and also just to manage one's expectations that within like an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, there's only so much we can cover in one's whole life.
Right, right,
Just
right.
to, it's not just like kind of rabbit out of the hat kind of situation. So we try to, for the birth chart analysis, I don't usually ask for anything except for the birth information first,
Mhm.
unless there's something very specific that someone wants to have answered, but I prefer to do that blindly.
Mhm.
And we can just go into some understanding of the birth chart and sort of answer some questions. And then if they're more interested in doing something like a predictive reading, the future, that, what's going on ahead of us, then I would ask about more specific questions like, well, are you trying to launch a business, or are you thinking about relocating, or is this a financial question? Um, so that's more beneficial to the individual, because sometimes we may need to dig up some more dates.
Mhm.
You may need to provide me with the date that you started your company, or there's more information that we could start playing with, so we can give more specific consultation.
And I know it's not like seeing a psychic, but yeah, and I have not really done that either. That's not something I'm interested in. But it was very interesting to for you to be like, okay, this period of your life is going to be busier. And it was funny. It felt grounded in a way that I was surprised by.
Mm.
Um, I don't know. I thought I had a question, but maybe that was just a statement. Um,
Well, I mean, I can actually, I do know what you mean, because sometimes people conflate the astrology. Oh, so you're an astrologer, so you're also psychic, you're also a tarot
right.
reader, you're
Right,
also
right, right,
shaman,
right, right.
whatever.
You
Like,
get
it
put
just
in, right, right. You're like, please, ayahuasca and cards. And you're like, no, 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 no.
yeah. But for my own practice, I focus on astrology. Of course, there are many people out there that do cards, and they're also psychic, so they incorporate different mediums. However, what I would say about this idea of intuition is that the more that we do anything and that we specialize in our work, and the more focused we are on that subject, when people have questions, you're of course, you're providing information based on astrological data,
Mhm.
but there's also just something that when you're in your workflow that you're able to answer these questions, and I think that everybody has that in all their work, that sense of intuitive knowing
Yeah,
when there's something that comes up, how
yeah,
to answer it in that
yeah.
moment, that you're like, oh, where did that come from? But is that all just experience, or is it, where did, that's, it's a gray area, and I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I think there is something really beautiful about what you do that probably helps people connect more deeply to their own intuitive knowing and that wisdom. And I even felt that, like, you really affirmed a lot of feelings I have around this period of my life and things that are coming up. What you were saying felt really true to my body. And then also, it is strange. Like, I think the older I get, like, I definitely did not grow up religious at all. My dad's a doctor. It was a very sort of science-based household. I didn't
Mhm.
grow up with any, real spirituality or anything like that. And it took until me getting quite sick and having no real answers, where I had to sort of go inward and go to school and study and trial and error with my body, which led me to meditation, because basically my adrenals were fucked up, and my regular doctor was like, I don't even know, you're talking about your gut health. This was like 15 years ago or almost.
Right.
And so I end up with a naturopath, and I'm grasping at straws to, like, stay afloat. And it
Mhm.
was funny because she was like, meditation is really the only thing besides sleep that helps heal the adrenals. And I fought it and I fought it. But when I gave into it, it was like, boom, it opened me up to this whole other connection to myself. And, as you continue to go down that path, like, your whatever you want to call it, right? That intuitive knowing, inner wisdom just gets stronger and stronger. And as I've continued to, and that helps me finally heal my body like 100%, right? Where there were things,
Yeah.
the external world was, eat this, not that, try this, not that. But you get to a point where like you just have to connect to that, your inner healer or your inner, you know, the person inside of you that knows, like you're the only one that knows what's best for you. And I think, no, it's so hard because we're not taught to listen or honor that, right? That's like not
Yes.
real. And you have to go to school and go outside yourself. And, in the US, especially, it's like you treat your body like a car, right? Like if you're sick, you bring it to the doctor, you listen to the doctor, you have no idea what's happening, right? And I
Yes.
think the older I get and the longer I'm in this space and the more people I get that come to me just like you in the midst of transformation and they're struggling and what you were saying, like everything that they were doing in their head is no longer working. So they're like, I'm going to have to
Yes.
try a lot of these other weird things, that it's so powerful, right?
Yes.
And like
Yes,
whatever
absolutely.
we can do to get people listening and honoring that, it's, I think, as important as, I mean, yes, you should still see a doctor. And yes, you should,
Yeah.
not just like base everything on the moon. But I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of value. And and I'll be the first to say that I've rolled my eyes at the idea of like astrology in the past, but like, especially yesterday, it, it reminded me of a lot of stuff I knew and really got me to connect in deeply and feel good about some things that I was like, oh, wow. Yep. Okay. I'm going to double down on this. This feels right. And what she's saying like really resonates. And like that felt like the truth. And I think empowering people in that way is incredible. So I think what you do is
Mm,
important.
I think it's also so, I think what you're saying is interesting because we are just, we're just using astrology to name something which doesn't feel very concrete in our lives. It feels like it's floating somewhere internally. And
Yeah.
sometimes we just need to describe it in a way that we use the planets to describe it, those energies, and they suddenly, when we get a visual, we can relate to it. We can
Yeah.
relate to it more and it feels more real. Like, okay, this is not just some weird voice in my head, it's the voice. It's
Yeah.
the right
Yeah. Yeah.
voice.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So yeah, I can relate to that absolutely. So yeah, no, I do think as we, in some sense, as we start to better get in tune, as we get in tune with things that are happening from a transit perspective, we then start to be able to be more aligned with, the cycles that we're currently in, and we stop resisting life so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I think is really beautiful about this and, eating seasonally or even like human design, right? Like things like that, the
Yes.
other modalities where it's just allowing you to listen and flow a little bit instead of kind of what we were talking about earlier. Like, no, I'm 30, I should be this. I'm 35, I should be this. I'm not hitting those
Yes.
benchmarks versus actually what feels right to me and how can I just like let go and flow in the direction of what I'm actually here to do. And it just was so wild the way you were talking about my purpose. And you're like, part of the way you're supposed to make money is like how you communicate. And I was like, Jesus, yeah, that's so crazy, right? Like, I'm like, that's so wild that, you know what I mean? I'm like, yeah, that affirms that. And truly, like, you said a couple of things to me yesterday that made me acknowledge and see parts of myself that I hadn't in 40 years. So I think that's really valuable and thank you. Like I really appreciated that. So if
I'm
people
so I'm so touched. I'm so touched to hear that. I really am.
yeah, yeah, no, it was absolutely I came out of it like I like did not expect. Well, I knew you like my intuition. I was like, oh, she's cool. And like I liked our conversation, but I just didn't. I was so pleasantly surprised because I think I do like, and it's funny. I think the longer I'm on this journey of my evolution and helping people, I think I do shy away from this kind of thing because, you know, you want people to take you seriously, or this stuff can feel
No,
so esoteric or not real, or, you know, you don't want to get labeled as too woo woo because then, God forbid, I don't believe in science or something like that, which is not true.
yeah.
And I just think there's a space for all of it. And I like, again, bringing on all kinds of people because I think that we need a team, right? We're
Yes,
here together, and there's so many, we can learn from each other. And I think if you're too far in any direction, you're missing wisdom. And the more we can
yes.
just be open and learn from each other, I think it's really incredible.
I think, at the very basic level as well, we can accept that the moon will affect the ocean's tides, for example. Or we already know that the sun and Jupiter, for example, they have an orbit that's very much interlinked. They're sort of interdependent, and
Mhm.
it influences the way that our solar system was constructed and currently exists. So that's just at a, that's physics. So
Right?
we can accept that. And we are ultimately just another animal. We're just another
Yeah.
part of human, nature. So I think these things at a certain level people can accept. And it's the idea that maybe we are not so much in control. That element, that part of astrology that I think people get a lot of fear around and then that they cast it off as woo-woo.
Yeah. Yeah.
But actually, if you just consider it as, well, we're just part of, nature's cycles. Don't have to overthink it. Don't have to
Yeah.
overthink it.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Okay. Two more questions before we wrap it up. How do people get in touch? What are you offering? What do you love doing the most? How do people find you, get in touch with you? They've heard this, they're excited. What do they do next?
They can reach out to me via my website. It's deborahlyna.com, or on my
We'll
Instagram
link.
page as well. Yes, and I offer birth chart analysis. I do predictive year ahead readings, relationship readings, and can also help choose dates for specific things. So a medley of different kind of readings. Definitely reach out and see what's important for your particular case.
Yeah. So if you feel so inclined, reach out and we'll put all of that in the show notes. And then finally, the question we ask all of our guests. When life hands you a whole bunch of Mercury in retrograde, assuming that's a bad thing, we want to use it in the term
That's funny.
before where we didn't understand, right? When life gets a little bit challenging and you get knocked down, what do you do to pull yourself back up? And it could be related to astrology, or it could just be like call your mom. What's your favorite tool to sort of, oh gosh, how did you phrase it when I texted you? It was so good. You made me laugh. I'll find it.
I think I said something like, what happens when you reach the bottom of hell?
Yeah, I think
Right? It
that's
was something like that.
it was very, let me see. You said, yeah, where do you go when you've reached the bottom of hell? And I was like, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
I did actually spend some time thinking, there's this one quote, which is, the weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. And it's by Gandhi. And
Mm.
I was thinking in the context of this question that part of the reasons that I sometimes feel like there's setbacks is an inability to forgive other people, or an inability to forgive myself, even, or
Mm.
even just have forgiveness for the whole situation and not try to assume that I understand
Mhm.
anything that has actually happened. And for me, coming back to this idea of forgiveness has been really important to help me love through it as well.
Ah, I love, that's
Yes.
beautiful. Beautiful. I think that is
Um,
important.
yeah, I mean, just, of course, like practically speaking, I think that I do have a much more different relationship now to this idea of fate and free will as things come and go and there's different challenges in life. Um,
Because
and
of your
I
understanding of
always,
astrology? Because of how you
yes, yes,
yeah. Do you want to speak a little bit more
absolutely.
about do you mind sharing a little bit about that? Like going a little
Yeah,
bit deeper into how that's changed your view?
I definitely feel like um, that I, that I surrender a lot more now to just the whole mystery of the cosmos, because although we can go into the chart and we can go into the nitty-gritty and we can maybe make some interesting predictions, the reality is that there's just it's all mystery.
Yeah.
How does this even work? How do these things really, manifest? There's some beauty in that. And I think the more that we can surrender to that, the more that we can be in flow. So I think the difference between doing prediction so that we can control the future, that's a sort of misnomer. We
Yeah.
just kind of starting to understand where the cycles are going.
Hmm.
But in the end, um, there's, this idea of control is just an illusion. So,
I mean, you
yes.
are speaking to my soul. I couldn't agree more. I feel like with every year, hands off the wheel a little bit more, trust that I truly believe that we do not know what's best for us. And it's
Yeah.
like if you can take care of yourself and you can listen to yourself, your intuition or whatever your body's telling you, and you can be present in the moment to make the best choice that feels right to you, then the rest of it is sort of not up to us. Like never in a million years did I think I would live in Portugal. Like this is like
Yes.
there's so many things that happened in the past few years of my life where I was like, I didn't see this coming, but it was way better than I expected and like great. So I couldn't, I mean,
Totally.
I'm with you. I am also a member of the Church of Surrender.
No, absolutely. And so, yeah, that's why I think this idea of forgiveness is always just sort of occupying my mind as a sort of means to find peace in whatever situation comes about. We just don't know.
Yeah, yeah. And that for me also goes along with um I just assume that everything, no matter how good or bad it is for my greatest good. Like it's like, okay, this
Yeah.
is something I need to learn from. And that always for me makes it easier to forgive and just sort of zoom out and feel like, oh, this person is just here to teach me something. This isn't personal.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yes. Yes. Yes.
that I find
Exactly.
that so incredibly helpful. This has been incredible. I mean, again,
I
I just sort of like threw it out. We met at a women's brunch a couple of weeks ago, and I just threw it out there because I was like, this is fascinating. I've never heard of medical astrology. Like, I've not talked to an astrologer. I don't know anything about this. This woman seems actually like she knows what she's talking about. She doesn't smell like patchouli. um, um, and yeah, so I just kind of threw it out there. And man, what a gift really the past 2 days have been. So thank you so much. And more to come. I will definitely, how you just got me thinking about a lot, and I have like a million more questions. So I'm going to have to schedule another session. But thank you. And thank you for, giving the time and sharing your genius and yeah, guys, if this resonates with you, I highly recommend. It was such a beautiful experience for me.
Well, thank you, first of all, and for having me here today, but also for such a rewarding conversation yesterday. Because
Oh,
it's an exchange. The process of a consultation is an exchange, it's a conversation. Sometimes it's a monologue, and that's okay too.
mhm.
But the exchange is also extremely rewarding and just so humbling. And I learned as much from my consultations as the exchange of astrology to the client. So thank you.
You're welcome. And that's such a beautiful way to look at it. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. 10 out of 10. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.